Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation with me, Happy Mon Jacob. Ever since the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States, there have been concerns about the stability of the international security order. On the one hand, Mr. Trump has consistently reduced the American engagement around the world. On the other, the People's Republic of China has consistently challenged the American supremacy in the international system. There seems to be a feeling that the world is heading towards great power rivalry. Is the world actually heading towards a great power rivalry? Is the instability in the international system overstated? To talk to us about this and more, we have Professor Sumit Ganguly. Professor Sumit Ganguly holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations at the Indiana University in Bloomington in the United States. Professor Ganguly is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is one of the most well-known and articulate and thoughtful scholars on international security in North America. Professor Ganguly, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Happy Mon.
Professor Ganguly, there seems to be a great deal of unwillingness in the United States today to take a leading role on several humanitarian issues around the world, refugee crisis, or even to be the mainstay of the international security order. What are the sources of this unwillingness and reluctance in the United States of America today?
I think this reluctance largely stems from the election of Donald Trump, who has a markedly different worldview than almost any of his predecessors. He has a vision of the United States as a leading power in the international system without wanting to assume any of the responsibilities that come with being a leading power in the global order. He does not want to expend any American resources unless they very narrowly and very specifically meet American needs as he defines them. So any notion of providing humanitarian assistance, of alleviating human suffering is not of any great concern to him unless there's some very specific benefit that could accrue to the United States.
But Professor Ganguly, is it really a new thing? For instance, in this 2015 book, Colin Duke, The Obama Doctrine, he writes that the United States has been cutting defense spending, withdrawing from certain alliance obligations, scaling back on deployments abroad, and reducing international expenditures. So this is probably not really, that is a direct result of the election of Donald Trump. This has started earlier on. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't, because during Obama's time, there was still a commitment, not always realized, to humanitarian action, to the promotion of democracy. On occasion, the administration did back off, for example, in Egypt, despite his initial speech in Cairo. But when confronted with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, Obama backed off. You do not find this kind of intellectual or moral or ethical consistency practically in any administration. But and defense budgets certainly did shrink, there's no question about it, but that did not mean a retreat from global engagement. What we are witnessing here under Trump is a significant retreat from global engagement, a complete lack of interest in supporting multilateral organizations and multilateral treaties, and a dramatic increase in the defense budget exceeding $700 billion.
What are its implications for international security, if at all any?
I think we are entering a period of what a friend of mine, Randall Schweiler, calls entropy. We are witnessing a period of growing disorder in the international system because certain rules of the road, whether one liked them or not, were upheld for the most part by the United States in the post-war era, the post-World War II era. Now, there were departures. These were not always uniformly pursued, but there was a rough and ready consensus around them. We are witnessing an individual and a handful of advisors surrounding him shredding any notion of these rules of the road. And behaving in an utterly unilateral fashion. Suddenly one yearns for the days of George W. Bush, whom one was highly critical of for undertaking unilateral actions, particularly in Iraq. But compared to what Trump is doing, Bush seems like a model of common sense and restraint.
This is interesting. So on the one hand, you are basically saying that there is this withdrawal of the American engagement abroad, and this is going to have serious implications for international order, as it were. There is also a feeling that there is the possibility of a great power conflict in the offing. Just take a look at some of the policy documents that came out of Washington this year and late last year. The national security document, the national defense strategy, and the nuclear proliferation review, all of them seem to be singling out China and Russia as challengers, rivals, and revisionist powers. This is a very interesting phraseology. Does this mean that there is a certain doctrinal trend in the United States which heralds the return of great power conflict and rivalry in the international system?
Oh, I most definitely think so, but there's also a degree of strategic incoherence, because on the one hand, the Department of Defense is trying to sort of focus on two potential over-the-horizon rivals, China and to a lesser degree Russia. Russia poses less of a threat because of all manner of domestic infirmities. Russia primarily is a threat because of the modernization of its nuclear weapons, its investment in hypersonic technology, and its the modernization of its military. China poses a much more multifaceted threat to the United States, ranging from attempts at economic domination to the acquisition of new military capabilities, for all the way from space to nuclear. And consequently, the Department of Defense has a reasonably coherent strategy for coping with the potential threats that could emerge from the PRC and from Russia. Whereas with Trump, it all depends, frankly, not even the time, not even the day of the week, but the time of day, about what the president would like to pursue in terms of dealing with potential adversaries.
But Professor Ganguly, given the soft corner that Mr. Trump has for Russia, for Mr. Putin, do you think the so-called rivalry between the Russian Federation and the United States is sort of overrated, that we may not necessarily see a conflict between the two sides simply because you have Mr. Trump as the president who does not have any or has a soft corner for Mr. Putin?
No, there's no question about it, and that's why I suggested there might be a degree of strategic incoherence. On the one hand, you have the Department of Defense, and to a lesser degree the Department of State, focused on the challenge that emerges from Russia. And then on the other hand, a president who is actually defying Congress and not imposing sanctions that have already been passed by the US Congress, one of the rare moments of bipartisanship. And then you also witnessed this event barely a week ago, where Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the United Nations, comes out with a fairly unequivocal and harsh statement on Russia, contradicted by the White House and by a White House official who says, well, perhaps she was confused. And to her credit, she immediately retorted and said, I don't get confused. And I think it was an important assertion of her authority and being undermined by one of the president's minions.
So what is the implication of this sort of a policy incoherence on the ground when the action needs to be taken, when decisions have to be taken? So what does it really translate into?
Yes, that's a vitally important question. I think it endangers America's interests and America's security over the longer horizon, for the simple reason that rivals and those who are hostile to the United States will seek to take advantage and exploit this kind of strategic disarray that characterizes this administration.
But Professor Ganguly, as an IR theorist, how do you look at the rise of China and the challenge that it is posing to the United States of America and the return of Russia to the scheme of things? Don't you see it as natural? This is how great powers behave. What's so abnormal about it?
Oh, there's nothing particularly abnormal about it. But the task before the United States is to develop a coherent strategy to deal with Russia and to deal with the PRC, and also to pursue a strategy that is not needlessly provocative. For example, the expansion of NATO, as many people have argued, needlessly provoked the Russians. Allowing certain states on the periphery of Russia to drift into the Western orbit caused a degree of anxiety. One does not have to be a fan of Vladimir Putin to recognize that even hostile powers have their own fears. That he and the Russians had a set of legitimate fears which were dismissed in considerable part by previous administrations, and to some degree one is paying a price for it.
You know, let's think a little about the transatlantic security partnership. This has lasted the good part of the Cold War. For 7 decades or so, you've had this robust relationship, robust partnership between the United States and its European allies. But it seems to be under stress today. What are the sources of the stress that the transatlantic partnership is facing today? Where do you think the problem is?
It's faced stresses before. You'll recall that Donald Rumsfeld made that rather callous remark about old Europe when the French and the Germans were not willing to promptly join the American effort to topple Saddam Hussein, and then he turned to Eastern Europe, and so certain strains already existed. But today we are almost witnessing a breach in that you have Chancellor Merkel increasingly concerned about Trump's very mercurial behavior. Macron is desperately trying, for some inexplicable reason, to try and work with Trump. I think he's going to come to grief over this. Theresa May is utterly preoccupied, for the most part, with Brexit. But the sources of this largely stem from the American unwillingness to support institutions that had long existed. Trump hesitated for a long time to endorse a clause in NATO which requires the United States to come to the assistance of its European partners. And this was a source of considerable anxiety to them. They're anxious about Trump's willingness to overlook any number of Putin's malfeasances. And particularly right now, they're especially concerned about Trump's willingness or seeming willingness to shred the JCPOA, the joint the program of action involved basically the treaty with Iran. By May 12th, he has to endorse it or walk away from it, and he's threatening to walk away from it, which causes considerable anxiety amongst America's European partners who are party to this treaty.
That's correct. I mean, in fact, there is a great deal of consensus within Europe of the need to continue with Iran.
Absolutely.
Even the visit of the French president to Washington, the language that the president used was very careful. He said you can look at the other things, but the deal has to continue.
Right.
But there is a fear in Washington, a certain amount of anxiety of being exploited by friends and enemies alike, that they have been investing in NATO, they have been sort of investing in friends in Europe, but they are exploiting the United States at the end of the day. Is that fear justified at least to some extent?
I would argue no. there are certain costs that a great power has to bear. If you want to be the global hegemon, then you have to provide certain public goods. And I don't think that this whole notion of America being exploited is largely a figment of Donald Trump's imagination. And of course, he has persuaded any number of people that the US has been exploited, but that is because he's tapping into a profoundly anti-intellectual, populist, know-nothing strain in American political culture. He has basically sort of unearthed a vein that had long existed in American political culture but had been mostly buried. But he's not the first to do it. I mean, people seem to think that Trump is utterly exceptional. He's not. Ronald Reagan did this on occasion. There are elements of it in George W. Bush. Statements made during the campaign trail, statements made while in office, but Trump sort of represents the apogee of this anti-intellectualism and populism, this toxic blend thereof.
Professor Ganguly, you very interestingly mentioned that if the United States wants to continue as the hegemon in the international system, then it has to take up certain responsibilities. Does the international system need a hegemon, even if it is a benign hegemon? As a theorist, what did you say?
Well, certain people who work on IR theory suggest that a hegemon is necessary for the provision of certain public goods. There is a whole literature on hegemonic stability. To enforce certain kinds of rules, to uphold a particular order, perhaps one does need a hegemon to ensure that there is not widespread cheating and that there is an adherence. It's difficult to visualize this in a completely diffused public, in a global order.
Is that your view as an IR theorist, or is that your personal view that the world probably needs a benign hegemon?
No, I think it's largely derived from my understanding of IR theory.
All right,
rather than a personal preference.
Sure, Professor Ganguly, let's come to the Korean Peninsula. A lot of things are happening there. As a student of international relations, what, according to you, best explains the current thaw in the Korean Peninsula?
In considerable part, because I think Kim realized that he's dealing with someone who is even more unpredictable and even more mercurial in his behavior than himself. And perhaps Trump's bluster, his posturing, his sheer unpredictability, his extremely hostile language, perhaps convinced Kim that it might be worth trying to negotiate with Trump for fear that things could truly get out of hand. I'm sure that's one consideration. The other is that Kim can't indefinitely pursue the policies that he was pursuing because domestically he's increasingly facing stress because his economy is quite fragile and increasingly paying a price because of sanctions.
But look at it this way, at the end of the day, Kim Jong-un has managed to have the cake and eat it too. He seems to have sort of won the game of chicken in the Korean Peninsula, hasn't he?
Yes, in some measure, because he has carried out a sufficient number of tests so that he can rely on his arsenal, and now he can pursue negotiations. But I simply do not see how Trump is going to bring about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, because that's the only trump card, so to speak, that Kim possesses.
So you don't expect an outcome in which North Korea denuclearizes itself?
I simply cannot visualize that. A freeze on further tests, a freeze on further missile tests, a freeze on the further production of nuclear material, I can visualize that. But I cannot see him completely defanging his state, because that's the only asset of any value that he possesses.
Is mainstreaming North Korea into the international nuclear order such a bad idea?
No, I don't think it's such a bad idea.
With its nuclear weapons?
No, and of course this position that I'm articulating would be roundly opposed by practically everyone in the non-proliferation community in the United States. They would be absolutely unyielding. They would suggest that this could have a cascading effect. I mean, the usual arguments would be trotted out. And the hypocrisy of the non-proliferation community lies in that they refuse to accept the fact that American nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapons of the 6 original states, have an impact on others considering nuclearization. They somehow want to separate the two. They argue, no, people pursue nuclear weapons for their own reasons. It has nothing to do with our possession of nuclear weapons. Whether or not we possess nuclear weapons has no impact. And I think this is an utterly specious argument.
So is that a Walesian argument in some sense? You are saying that you're probably, if I understood you correctly, you're probably saying that you're willing to live with a nuclear capable North Korean state, provided it is mainstreamed into the international system properly. Have I got it accurately? Or
yes, because look, it's a kind of a accomplished fact that they are a nuclear weapons state. This is sort of like King Canute telling the sea not to come any further because it's going to reach his throne. Well, the sea doesn't care. And I mean, I can envision a time when Kim's not around, when there's a different political configuration within North Korea, when another regime might say, we have no sort of fixed hostility towards South Korea, and we can even start thinking about reunification, and in that process we will forego our nuclear weapons. But unless you are prepared to start a war on the Korean Peninsula with utterly unforeseen and potentially disastrous consequences, I don't see how you're going to get this regime to forego the one asset, that the one bargaining chip that they possess. I mean, it just strikes me as a kind of a fruitless and a fool's errand for the most part.
That's interesting. So what do you think is the implication of North Korea being mainstreamed in the international nuclear order? Is China the big loser? Will it lead to a certain shift in balance of power in the Korean Peninsula? I mean, the Americans and North Koreans are going to talk. Japan is in the know of things, and South Korea is in the picture. Although Kim met the Chinese president, China seems to be sort of out of the picture in the way that things are evolving in the Korean Peninsula.
All that is quite murky. One doesn't quite know the extent of the relationship between China and Kim, particularly since Kim recently traveled to China before this potential summit with Trump comes up. The key concern about a mainstreamed North Korea would be the security of Japan and South Korea. Those would be the fundamental issues that would remain, because both South Korea and Japan fret about what long-term threat Kim could pose if he was allowed to keep his nuclear weapons, and if the kinds of sanctions that are currently in place were no longer in place, because Kim has demonstrated a capacity for fairly intransigent, fairly hostile rhetoric, and one wonders about the stability of that regime. And if you are in such close proximity as South Korea and Japan, then you have to fret, because ultimately you are relying on the United States for your security against Kim. And if the American commitment at any point becomes shaky, and North Korea exists that has now been recognized in a rough and ready fashion as a nuclear weapon state and free of sanctions, then there's a cause for real anxiety in Tokyo and Seoul.
Let's talk about what is a deal likely to look like between the United States and North Korea. Does it involve the withdrawal of sanctions and acceptance of North Korean nuclear weapons? Will it be is it likely to be a written agreement? Is it likely to be a multi-party agreement like the Iranian nuclear deal? What is it likely to be?
I can't visualize a situation where the United States is going to agree to a nuclearized North Korea being mainstreamed, for the simple reason that the left and the right in the US can't agree on very much anymore. In fact, the polarization in the US now is almost at an unprecedented historical level. But the one thing that unites people in the non-proliferation community, whether on the right or on the left, is that we're not going to permit a state like North Korea to possess nuclear weapons. This is where liberals and conservatives will readily come together. India was a completely different matter. There, the old liberal non-proliferation community proved to be utterly hostile. But many of the conservatives said, hey, look, this is a democratic state. It's a potential bulwark against China. We don't know how the Chinese are going to behave in Asia. The Indians are not threatening anybody with their nuclear weapons. The Indians have an impeccable non-proliferation record, except for that can-do reactor business, which the liberals invariably bring up, as if the US has never had an infraction of its non-proliferation rules and laws. So I think it's frankly a red herring. But North Korea is a totally different kettle of fish. And this is where you get this kind of unity amongst people who otherwise can't even agree on the shape of the universe. But they can agree that North Korea cannot be allowed. This is such a malevolent regime that the possession of nuclear weapons cannot be conceived of. So I am deeply pessimistic about these talks. And especially given that the principal negotiator is President Trump, whose capacity for negotiation seems to be virtually non-existent.
More importantly, his threats about undoing the Iranian nuclear deal will play a role.
If I was Kim, why would I sign on to an agreement knowing that the United States could back away from it? It's the worst possible precedent that you could set. I mean, it's appalling. There's no other word for it.
Before I move on to my next question, I have to ask you this. Do you think more nuclear weapons lead to more international stability?
This is a hardy perennial, isn't it?
I have to ask you that question.
No, I would say it depends.
Okay.
And here I have to be extremely careful lest I appear hypocritical or dishonest or worse. because I have argued that under certain circumstances, the possession of nuclear weapons by India and Pakistan actually has stabilized the relationship. And I have been quite unequivocal about it, both in print and verbally. However, you can't make a blanket statement. Certain kinds of deployments, the acquisition of certain capabilities, the configuration of certain, the adoption of certain strategies can be destabilizing. So even while at a general level a nuclear dyad should be a force for stability, especially if both sides possess secure retaliatory capabilities. Yes, but certain kinds of deployments, the acquisition of certain kinds of weaponry, their deployment in particular ways.
Give an example.
Take, for example, Pakistan's increasing willingness to invest in tactical nuclear weapons is a deeply destabilizing.
How about India's investment in ballistic missile defense?
I was going to come to that next, and I've also written about that, and I've written quite critically about it, because Pakistan then construes this as an attempt to seek escalation dominance on the part of India, and particularly to seek a first strike advantage. This is how Pakistani decision makers are bound to construe this, and it will lead to a most unfortunate situation in the region and a potential for an arms race spiral.
Let me ask you something about the growing ties between India and the United States. There is a feeling in India that the strengthening of Indo-US ties will lead to reduction in India's strategic autonomy, something that the government of India and the strategic thinkers in India have been very, very particular about maintaining. The feeling in India is that the United States would like to use India as a check against the rising China in the region. Do you think that the growing relationship between India and the United States is worrying on the one hand, and does it also mean that the Americans would like to use India as a checkmate against a growing rising China in the region and around the world?
There's no question about it that the US would like to see India as a potential balancer against China. Not necessarily to contain China, but to balance the growth of Chinese power and Chinese assertiveness in Asia. I think that's fairly obvious. Would it lead to a loss of strategic autonomy? Let me respond to that in two different ways. First, the people who keep shouting about strategic autonomy from the rooftops of New Delhi seem to suffer from a peculiar form of historical amnesia. Between 1972 and 1989, where was your strategic autonomy? You were utterly dependent on the Soviet Union. Now, you could make a perfectly...
There was a Cold War context to it.
Sure, there was a Cold War context to it. But was there strategic autonomy during this period?
Right.
No. On a number of issues, India had to tread very carefully because it could ill afford to alienate the Soviet Union.
Which is what is happening today. Because India is getting closer to the United States, it is alienating traditional allies like the Russian Federation.
I'm not sure that the Russian Federation was such a traditional ally. Again, there is historical amnesia. There was a significant period, particularly under Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, where the Russians said, you are a third-rate power. Get lost. The Cold War is over. We have no need for you. We have these wealthy Western friends now who we are going to court. We're, Europeans. You are a sort of a squalid third world country. Go, buy your weapons from somewhere else. If you want weapons from us, come pay, in hard currency. I mean, people tend to forget that there was a distinct period when the entire relationship was in a state of disarray. And the Russians are perfectly pragmatic. I mean, they will dump you when the occasion arises. And this kind of nostalgia for the Cold War, it seems to permeate Indian thinking. Those days are over. The world is structurally different than it was during the Cold War.
Well, that's a very powerful argument. What about the BRI? Some people, at least in India, feel that India prematurely said no to BRI. BRI is a futuristic mega project, and India should have been more careful and thought through it before saying completely no to it. Do you think India should have been part of the BRI and probably even CPEC, given the fact that CPEC potentially offers the possibility of a rapprochement between India and Pakistan if China is involved and if there is an uptick as far as economic development in the region is concerned, considering the fact that this is the least interconnected region in the whole world. So what's your sort of take on CPEC, BRI and India's position on these two?
On CPEC, I suspect it was much too difficult for this particular regime to suggest that, yes, it's perfectly all right for China to build a road through disputed territory. Or actually, they wouldn't even say disputed. They would say Pakistani occupied territory. I mean, they would be quite categorical about it. And it would be extremely difficult for a regime like the present regime to make that kind of concession. So I'm not surprised that they took a hard line on CPEC. On BRI, perhaps a bit more consultation or discussion was possible. On the other hand, the high-handedness of the PRC in the recent past probably played a role in India saying, no, we don't want to be part of this initiative.
But would you agree there should have been more consultations before India closed the doors?
Perhaps a bit more consultation, but the problem is the Chinese have not been always forthcoming in terms of their goals and interests. They have dissembled on these matters so much, and they have penetrated so many of India's neighbors and have sought to turn the neighbors against India, that I am not entirely shocked that India took this hands-off attitude and chose not to engage in consultations. Because I think there is a degree of dishonesty on the part of the PRC, which India really must confront.
Very quickly, how do you evaluate Mr. Modi's foreign policy?
Extremely uneven. In certain areas, I think he has demonstrated a degree of resolve. He has demonstrated a willingness to engage a series of partners. He has sort of broken some China in the process, so to speak. But I don't think he has, as his supporters suggest, brought about a paradigm shift or a revolution in Indian foreign policy. I think there is much greater continuity than meets the eye. As a friend of mine, Chris Ogden, has called it, he refers to this as a tone shift. Yes, not a fundamental shift. And in my own writings, I have not used that term, but that's basically where I come out.
My last question, tell us something about the book that you recently published on India's national security.
This is our attempt to have a comprehensive handbook of India's national security, including on subjects which I believe are non-existent, which shouldn't be in there. For example, an entire chapter on constructivism. Okay. But in the interests of it's a handbook. Hence, you have to pursue a form of intellectual pluralism. There's a chapter on environment and security. I think the environment is vitally important. I don't think it's a security issue. But there's a chapter. There's a chapter on refugees, migration, and security. I think these are perfectly compelling issues, but I don't think we should continually stretch the word security to include everything, including traffic accidents in New Delhi.
Well, you edited it. You edited the book.
I edited the book, and this is my commitment to intellectual pluralism.
Excellent. I'd like to summarize the 3 or 4 points that Professor Shumeet Ganguly made during our discussion today. One is about the entropy that he talked about. He refers to a certain amount of growing entropy in the international system, and he says that is worrying. It will lead to a lot more chaos and anarchy in the international system, which means a lot of uncertainty and the inability to predict the future events, as it were. I think that is something that we're going to take very seriously. The second point that Professor Ganguly made was about the policy incoherence in the United States today. There is a perceived policy incoherence, and this is being made use of by the rivals, as it were, China and Russia. This is also ceding a lot more ground to China and Russia to make use of the American withdrawal from the international system, as it were. The third point that Professor Ganguly made is about the way ahead for India. And he believes that the way ahead for India in this sort of a chaotic environment where you have the withdrawal of the American, the withdrawal of the United States of America from around the world, you have the rise of China, you have a certain partnership between China, Russia and Pakistan. So the way ahead probably is a strategic partnership with the United States. And he says, he advises not to worry too much about the argument from strategic autonomy. That's really not going to help India for a very long time if you depend entirely on that in a sort of puritanical sense of the term. He advises us to sort of make use of the opportunities that are available in the international system. Finally, he makes a very interesting argument about, when I asked him about what he thought about Mr. Modi's foreign policy, he says there is no major shift. He calls it, paraphrasing Chris Ogden, he says it's a tone shift, not a fundamental shift in India's foreign policy. A lot of what has been going on before Modi came to power is still continuing. There is no fundamental shift. Professor Ganguly, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks
for coming
very
on the show.
much, everyone.